Baby found a German Shepherd puppy trapped in a wall and wouldn't leave without him. My 3-year-old son was kneeling by a wall, and the wall was barking back. It was a bright, cloudless afternoon in San Diego. Henry's little knees were pressed into the warm dirt, his tiny hands braced on the concrete. "Daddy's stuck! Help him!" he shouted, pointing to a jagged hole. I crouched down and froze. Two frightened eyes stared back at me from the shadows. A German Shepherd puppy, no older than 7 months. His muzzle poked through just enough for me to see the dust in his fur and the tremble in his jaw. At first, my instinct was to pull Henry back. A strange dog, trapped, scared. It could be dangerous. But then I saw the way the puppy's eyes softened the moment Henry spoke again. "It's okay, puppy. Daddy, help." I scanned the wall. The edges around the hole weren't just broken. They were sealed. I touched the rough surface and felt the hardened crust of dried cement. This wasn't an accident. Someone had put him here. My chest tightened. Who could do this to a German Shepherd puppy? Henry leaned in closer, reaching his hand toward the narrow opening. The puppy licked his fingertips, a desperate dry lick like he hadn't tasted kindness in days. "Puppy thirsty?" Henry asked. I swallowed hard. His little voice carried no doubt, only certainty. We were going to help. I just didn't know how. The wall was thick, the space behind it small. Any wrong move could hurt him. I looked around. No one in sight, no noise except the shallow, raspy breaths coming from that dark hollow. I could feel his heart pounding through the concrete. Henry looked up at me, eyes wide. "Daddy." And I hurried. And I realized if we didn't act now, this German Shepherd puppy might not survive another hour. The cement bit into my fingers and told me the truth I didn't want to know. Someone had sealed a living heart into stone. I pulled Henry back to a safe line in the dust and forced my voice to sound calm. "Stay by my knee, buddy." "Okay, Daddy," he whispered, eyes locked on the hole. Inside, the German Shepherd puppy panted shallow and fast, each breath echoing in that tight pocket like a ticking clock. I cupped water from Henry's sippy bottle into my palm and held it to the slit of light. A rough tongue scraped my skin, grateful and frantic, and the sound it made, small gulps against concrete, broke something in me I hadn't noticed, was still fragile. I scanned the wall in the bright San Diego sun. This wasn't a random break. The edges were too square, the smear marks too intentional. Whoever did this meant for him to be hidden, not found. Heat shimmered off the sidewalk. I dialed Charlotte. Bring gloves, towels, the small pry bar, and that old chisel, and Henry's beach bucket. Water. She heard my voice and didn't ask questions. On my way. Henry squatted again. Close but careful. The way kids learn to be gentle before they learn the word for it. "It's okay, puppy," he breathed. "Daddy, help." I slid 2 fingers through the gap and felt warm fur, then bone where the skin pulled tight. No collar tag, dry as dust. He gave a tiny rumble, more plea than growl, and pressed his face into the light like it hurt to leave the dark. I talked to him the way I would to a scared kid. "Hey, Beethoven, I'm right here." "We'll do this slow." The name just came out, heavy and kind. Henry smiled. "Beethoven," he tested, careful around the syllables. "Good boy." I looked for seams. The wall was a cheap repair job. Patched cement over a hollow space between old cinder blocks. A utility panel nearby meant rebar and wire might be riding behind the face. If I smashed blindly, I could cut him. If I pried, I could shift weight onto his ribs. I pressed my ear to the concrete. The puppy's breathing rattled like paper bags. I needed a way to widen the mouth without sending a rain of stone onto him. Charlotte's car turned the corner. She jogged over with tools and a bottle of water, sun striking the metal like a promise. "Oh, God," she gasped, kneeling. "Who would?" She stopped herself for Henry's sake and passed me the pry bar. I wrapped a towel around the edges to keep splinters from falling in. "Henry, pour water here, slow." "Water, puppy," he said, solemn, as if reading a prayer. Beethoven licked and then pressed closer, ribs catching on jagged cement. "Listen, buddy," I murmured. "When I lift, you push your shoulders up." I slid the chisel under a weak lip and leaned the bar just enough to test the give. The wall answered with a dry groan. Dust sifted down. Beethoven flinched, then stilled. Trusting. Trusting me. Come, puppy, Henry urged, tiny hand, hovering. I felt the lip flex. A clean crack would save him. A bad one could bury his head. I took a breath, set the angle, and pulled harder, steady, praying the line would break where I needed it to. And the wall answered with a sharp ping. Metal singing somewhere inside, followed by a slow, heavy shift I couldn't control. The slab lurched and I threw my shoulder into the wall, catching it with the towel-wrapped bar as dust coughed into our faces. Charlotte yanked Henry back. A fist-sized chip dropped and shattered near the hole. Beethoven jerked, eyes wide, then forced himself still, like he decided that trusting us hurt less than fear. "Daddy, careful," Henry cried. "Puppy, okay?" I swallowed grit. "He's okay." I wasn't sure. His breasts fluttered like torn paper, but I needed him to hear certainty. I reset the bar higher, found a hairline seam, and worked the chisel in with slow, patient pressure. The concrete answered with a dry crackle, the sound of old neglect. Heat hammered the San Diego sidewalk. I wet a corner of the towel, squeezed a ribbon of water into the gap. Beethoven lifted his tongue barely and caught it, then pressed his muzzle forward until his whiskers scraped my knuckles. "Puppy thirsty," Henry said. "Solemn water." Charlotte poured into the beach bucket, and I spooned more along the edge, enough to cool the dust and calm his breathing. Up close, he smelled like old rain and fear. A German Shepherd puppy, 7 months, and already carrying a story too heavy for his bones. I searched for smarter leverage. The patch job was cheap. Surface cement slathered over a hollow that ran a foot deep, maybe more. I widened the top lip, chipping outward, always pulling shards away so nothing fell in. "Hey, Beethoven," I murmured, letting the name settle like a promise. "When I lift, tuck your chin, then push your shoulders up slow." He blinked once, undering or hope pretending to be understanding. "Come, puppy," Henry whispered, kneeling again, tiny hand hovering like a blessing. I shifted the bar. The lip flexed. Another thin seam showed itself like a door frame, and I followed it, shaving a crescent until light spilled inside the pocket. Beethoven inhaled deep for the first time, ribs fluttering, then braced. I slid 2 fingers along his chest through the opening, feeling the tremor under his skin. "On my pull," I said softly. "Easy." That's when I felt it, a taut snag high on his shoulder. I probed gently and found a sliver of rusted wire or mesh biting across the hollow. Some handyman had left metal inside. The patch had trapped him against it. If he surged forward now, it wouldn't free him. It would scrape him raw. "Wire," I told Charlotte Cutters. She scanned the tote. "Not here." Her eyes flicked to the street. "Garage 10 minutes. Henry's face pinched. "No leave." "It's okay," I said. "I've got him." She ran. I kept my palm on Beethoven's chest so he felt the anchor, so he knew waiting was also a kind of rescue. "Good boy." Slow breaths. The wall answered with a long, tired groan, the wire humming under my fingertip, tightening by a whisper as the sun climbed and Charlotte disappeared at the corner. And I realized we might not have 10 minutes at all. Charlotte's footsteps faded down the street, and the air between the concrete and my hands felt hotter, tighter. Beethoven shifted just enough for me to see the faint scrape where the mesh pressed his shoulder. He didn't whine. He didn't pull. He just blinked slowly, as if saving every drop of energy for the moment it would matter. A German Shepherd puppy shouldn't have to be this patient, but he was teaching me the pace he needed. I let my fingers rest against his fur so he knew I was still there. Henry crouched close, mimicking me, palm on the wall. "Stay, puppy," he whispered, and Beethoven's ear twitched toward that small voice. I poured another ribbon of water along the towel and let it slide down to him. He caught it with quick licks, then looked past me toward the sunlit street like he could feel Charlotte bringing hope with her. The heat pushed at both of us. I could see dust drying on his whiskers as fast as I wiped it. His chest rose, fell, held, a rhythm I matched with the careful pry of the bar, testing without shifting the mesh. When the sound of Charlotte's return finally threaded through the air, Beethoven's eyes lifted. He could see the movement before I could, ears pricking in the gloom. She dropped to her knees with the cutters, her face tight but gentle. "Okay, boy," I murmured. "You're going to feel me touch your shoulder." I slid my fingers in, mapping the wire's angle. He stayed still until the metal's bite loosened. Then his head turned just enough to catch my wrist with a warm brush of fur, as if to say, "Keep going." Henry leaned in breathless. "Come, puppy." Beethoven shifted, his ribs grazing the opening, one paw reaching toward the light. I worked the mesh free on the other side, Charlotte catching the tiny scraps before they could fall against him. The moment the last thread let go, his body quivered, not from fear, but from the permission to move. I widened the hole with slow, steady lifts, every crack in the cement answered by his measured push forward. The lip under his hips gave a sighing crumble. "Come, puppy!" Henry cried. Beethoven's back leg slid free an inch, then another, until his whole body surged forward into my arms. For a heartbeat, he went limp, letting me carry the weight. Then he twisted enough to put his paws on the ground beside Henry. He didn't run. He stood there, pressed against my leg, sides heaving, eyes half closed, as the sun washed over him for the first time in who knows how long. Henry reached out and touched his shoulder. "Puppy out," he said softly, almost in awe. Beethoven turned his head and rested his muzzle on that tiny hand, as if the world outside the wall could start right there. Beethoven stayed so still beside Henry, it was like he'd been holding his breath for days and only now remembered to let it go. His ears twitched at every sound, passing cars, the rustle of leaves, but he didn't flinch. He just kept leaning his shoulder into Henry's touch as if that was the only thing keeping him upright. I knelt to check him over. Dust streaked his coat, and under it his frame felt too light for a 7-month-old German Shepherd puppy. When my fingers brushed his ribs, he shivered. Not from pain, but from something older. The kind of caution dogs carry when they've learned not to expect kindness. Henry crouched low, holding the water bottle like it was treasure. "Puppy thirsty?" he asked, already tilting it. Beethoven's nose bumped the rim before his tongue found the water. Slow at first, then faster. Each lap a little more confident. Charlotte wiped her eyes and said, "He's so young. Who could?" But her voice trailed off. I didn't answer. The question was too big for right now. Beethoven drained half the bottle before pulling back, licking his nose, eyes half closed in the sunlight. Then, without warning, he shifted closer to Henry and gave the boy's cheek the gentlest lick. Henry giggled high and unguarded. "Puppy kiss," he announced. And just like that, something in Beethoven's posture loosened, shoulders dropping, tail giving the smallest wag. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was a first crack in whatever wall he'd built inside. I glanced at the gap in the actual wall behind us, a jagged hole in the cement that would be patched and forgotten by most who passed it. But for Beethoven, that space was more than a hole. It was the place his life had been on pause, and now he'd stepped through it. "Let's get you home, buddy," I said, slipping my arm under him. He didn't fight the lift. His weight felt fragile in my hands, like carrying a stack of dry leaves. Henry trotted beside me, one small hand resting on Beethoven's back the whole way to the truck. When we set him in the back seat, he didn't curl up. He sat upright, watching us as if trying to figure out if this was another trick. Charlotte leaned over the seat. "It's okay, puppy. Daddy, help." Her voice was calm, certain. Beethoven blinked slow, then lowered himself onto the blanket we'd spread for him. As I started the engine, Henry whispered, "Puppy, stay." His tone wasn't a question so much as a hope. I didn't answer yet. Beethoven's eyes met mine in the mirror, and I thought, not if I can help it. The road home felt longer than usual, every bump making Beethoven shift and glance toward the window. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just kept his gaze moving between Henry, Charlotte, and the blur of trees outside. Henry leaned close, tiny fingers tracing slow lines along Beethoven's back. "Puppy soft," he murmured, as if telling himself a secret. Every time Henry's hand paused, Beethoven's ear flicked back, waiting until the touch returned. Charlotte reached over the seat and offered him a small piece of bread. He sniffed it, hesitated, then took it gently from her fingers, chewing like he wasn't sure what to do next. "He's so polite," she said softly, but I knew it wasn't manners. It was survival. Dogs who've gone without learn to eat quietly, quickly, without drawing attention. As we turned onto our street in Raleigh, the afternoon sun lit up the yard bright green after last night's rain. Beethoven sat taller, watching the driveway, the front porch, the old oak tree swaying in the breeze. His ears tipped forward like he was memorizing each detail, trying to decide if this was somewhere he could belong. When I opened the door, he stepped out slowly, paws landing on the gravel with deliberate care. Henry hopped down beside him. "Come, puppy," he called, heading toward the grass. Beethoven followed, not because of the command. He didn't know it yet, but because Henry was moving, and maybe movement meant safety. Inside, the smell of dinner from earlier lingered in the air. Beethoven's nose twitched as he explored the entryway. He stopped by the couch, then the bookshelf, glancing back at us each time as if asking permission. I crouched low. "It's your home now, buddy," I said quietly. He didn't understand the words, but he seemed to feel the intent. Henry ran to his room and returned with a stuffed bear, holding it out. "Puppy toy." Beethoven sniffed it, then to everyone's surprise lay down right there on the rug with the bear between his paws. His head lowered slowly until it rested on the toy, eyes half closing. Charlotte leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "He's exhausted." I nodded, but inside I knew it was more than that. This was the first time in who knows how long he'd been able to rest, without listening for footsteps. And as the late sun poured across the floor, catching the soft rise and fall of his chest, I thought this might be the first time he's felt even a flicker of safe. That night, Beethoven didn't want to be alone. Every time I stepped away, his head lifted, eyes following me until I came back. So we made a bed for him in the living room, an old blanket folded twice, Henry's stuffed bear tucked beside it. When the house grew quiet, I sat on the floor next to him. He inched closer until his side pressed against my leg, warm and steady. His breathing was slow, but every so often a tremor rippled through him that, like some buried memory surfacing in sleep. I found myself whispering, "It's over now, buddy. No more walls. No more being stuck." Around midnight, I felt a tiny presence at my shoulder. Henry, hair messy from sleep, clutching his own blanket. "Puppy scared?" he asked, voice barely above a breath. "Maybe," I admitted. "Stay with him?" I nodded, and Henry curled up on the other side of Beethoven's small hand, resting on the dog's fur. Beethoven shifted, his head landing gently across Henry's legs. In that moment, the tension in his body eased, like he decided for now these were his people. I watched them both drift off, the rhythm of their breathing matching until it was impossible to tell who was comforting who. By morning, sunlight spilled across the room, catching on Beethoven's coat. He lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of birds outside. Henry sat up and grinned. "Puppy walk." Beethoven's tail thumped twice in answer. We stepped outside into the cool air, the leash loose in my hand because he stayed close without it. He sniffed the yard, the fence, the base of the oak tree, but kept looking back to make sure Henry was still there. At the end of the driveway, a neighbor waved. "New addition," she called. I glanced down at Beethoven, who was standing a little taller now, chest out, ears forward. "Yeah," I said, feeling the truth of it settle in. "He's home." But in his eyes, I saw something else. Like he wasn't just exploring. He was checking, making sure the world outside this house wasn't waiting to take it all away again. By the third week, Henry and Beethoven had created a language only they seemed to understand. It wasn't words, not really. Just a series of little sounds, giggles and shared glances that made me feel like an outsider to their private world. I'd find them sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, Henry stacking wooden blocks while Beethoven carefully knocked them over with the gentlest tap of his paw, as if making sure not to hurt his tiny human's feelings. Henry would squeal again, "Puppy," and Beethoven would tilt his head, then nudge another block with that same deliberate care. It amazed me how this German Shepherd puppy, barely 7 months old, seemed to know the difference between rough play and the tender handling a 3-year-old needed. When Henry dropped his spoon at breakfast, Beethoven picked it up in his mouth and dropped it right into Henry's lap. Henry clapped, "Good puppy!" Music. And Beethoven wagged like he just won a medal. Every morning after that, Henry made it his job to check on Beethoven. He'd toddle over with his little cup of water, saying, "Puppy thirsty," and wait until Beethoven drank before taking his own sip of milk. And Beethoven, he started following Henry everywhere, his eyes never leaving him. If Henry went to his toy box, Beethoven was right behind. If Henry sat on the porch, Beethoven lay across his feet like a living blanket. One afternoon, I watched something that stuck with me. Henry was trying to put on his tiny rain boots, struggling with the second one. Beethoven lay down in front of him and placed his chin on Henry's knee as if offering silent encouragement. Henry leaned forward, patted his head and whispered, "Help me, puppy." I swear Beethoven nudged that boot just enough for Henry to slip it on. There were moments when Beethoven's watchfulness turned protective. If Henry tripped in the yard, Beethoven was there before me, standing guard until I arrived. If another dog barked from across the street, Beethoven stepped slightly in front of Henry, ears alert but body calm, as if saying, "I'm here. You're safe." Charlotte and I began to notice changes in Henry too. He started sharing without being asked, half his cookie to Beethoven, his favorite toy car placed gently between those big paws. And Beethoven responded with the kind of patience I'd only seen in seasoned therapy dogs. Never a young rescue still learning trust. One rainy day, the two of them sat by the window, noses nearly touching the glass, watching water race down the driveway. Henry pressed his palm to the window, and Beethoven pressed his paw right beside it. It was such a simple thing, but in that moment, I realized something. They weren't just friends anymore. They were each other's anchor. But as their bond grew stronger, so did Beethoven's attachment, and with it, a fear I hadn't seen before. If Henry was out of sight for more than a few minutes, Beethoven paced, whining softly, scanning the house until he found him. I didn't know it yet, but that need to keep Henry close, it was about to be tested in a way none of us expected. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that feels too ordinary for anything to go wrong. Charlotte was folding laundry, Henry was in the backyard playing with his red ball, and Beethoven was stretched out under the shade of the oak tree, watching him like he always did. I was inside fixing the back door latch when I heard it. Beethoven's bark, sharp and urgent, nothing like his usual playful woof. I ran to the window just in time to see the ball rolled toward the side gate, the one that sometimes didn't latch all the way. Henry, chasing after it, didn't notice the gap where the wood had warped. Before I could shout, a delivery truck rattled past on the street, startling him. He froze for a split second, just enough time for Beethoven to act. The puppy shot across the yard faster than I'd ever seen him move, sliding his body between Henry and the open gate. His bark deepened, loud and commanding, his whole stance screaming, "Stay back!" Henry looked up at him, confused, clutching the ball to his chest. I bolted outside, heart hammering, just as a gust of wind pushed the gate wider. Beethoven didn't flinch. He nudged Henry backward with his nose, step by step, never breaking his guard on that opening. When I reached them, I scooped Henry up, feeling his small arms wrapped tight around my neck. "Puppy, help," he said into my shoulder, voice shaky, but sure. I bent down and ruffled Beethoven's fur. "Yeah, buddy, you did." His ears flicked back for a second, almost shy at the praise, before he leaned in to sniff Henry's hair, making sure his little human was really okay. The rest of the day, Beethoven stuck closer than usual, shadowing Henry's every move. If Henry went to the kitchen, Beethoven followed. If he sat on the couch, Beethoven hopped up beside him, one paw resting across Henry's lap like a claim. Charlotte whispered to me later, "He's not just watching over him, he's keeping him here." That night, after Henry fell asleep, I found Beethoven lying outside his bedroom door. His eyes were half closed, but the moment I stepped into the hall, his gaze sharpened, alert, ready. I realized then that for Beethoven, protecting Henry wasn't just instinct anymore. It was his purpose. I didn't know it yet, but that day had changed something. Beethoven had saved Henry once, and deep down I knew he'd do it again without hesitation. But in his mind, maybe he was still the puppy in the wall, trapped until someone came for him. Now it was his turn to make sure Henry never felt that same fear. And the test of that promise was closer than I wanted to believe. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, the air was warm enough for the windows to be open, letting in the smell of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. Charlotte was making pancakes. Henry was at the kitchen table stacking blocks, and Beethoven was sprawled nearby, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every sound. It was peaceful until the sudden sharp screech of tires outside shattered it. Henry's blocks toppled as he looked toward the door. Beethoven's head shot up, ears pinned forward. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a high-pitched whimper from somewhere beyond our yard. Beethoven was on his feet instantly, muscles tense, gaze locked on the front porch like he could see through the door. I stepped outside and saw a stray dog bolting down the street, frantic, weaving between cars. People were shouting, but no one was moving to help. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Henry, already halfway down the walkway, clutching Beethoven's ball in his hand like he thought the stray might want to play. Henry! My voice cracked, but Beethoven was faster. He cut in front of Henry, planting himself as a wall of fur and muscle, his deep bark slicing through the chaos. Henry froze, startled, and I lunged forward to grab him. Beethoven didn't relax. His eyes tracked the stray until it disappeared around the corner, his body trembling with adrenaline. Back inside, Henry dropped the ball on the floor and looked at Beethoven. "Puppy, save me," he said softly, wrapping his arms around Beethoven's neck.